Charles Leclerc is the next man to make a big move in the F1 driver market, and he's sticking with Ferrari for a long time. Scott, if you were in his position, if you were fortunate enough to be Charles Leclerc, would you be signing the deal he's just signed? And is it a risk?
There's definitely a risk. Whether or not I'd be committing myself to a team that hasn't won an F1 title since before I was even relevant in karting for this long, for several years across a rule cycle, I'd probably need about as many million reasons to do it as it looks like Leclerc has. There are obviously more reasons for this than just cash, which we'll get into. But yeah, as it's not doesn't look like it's 100% a done deal yet, but we've known for a long time that Leclerc is going to stick with Ferrari, and that he has his reasons for doing so, and that it probably will take him sort of more in cycle with other drivers, maybe even a little bit longer. According to La Gazzetta dello Sport, which obviously sometimes with Italian media and issues around Ferrari, you have to take it with a little bit of a pinch of salt, but when it comes to driver speculation, they're normally pretty hot on the money. So I think we can take it as read that Leclerc has done what amounts to a pretty mega deal. It's just, how sound are the reasons for that?
I think it says a lot about how difficult it is to choose your destiny as a driver, because signing a megabucks, very long-term deal with Ferrari on paper should be great, but it's still seen as a risk. But then again, so is just about everywhere else. Even Red Bull, there's the whole question about the 26 power unit. So it's really, really tough, because you need to make these long-term deals now in Formula One, but you just don't know what the landscape's going to be like in a couple of years, let alone 5 years' time. So it's this incredible mix of risk and sensible, and it's really a coin toss as to whether this is a good move or not. Could pay off brilliantly.
It's one of those with the risks and that sort of place in the driver market that you're taking such a leap of faith in your own ability, not just where your team that you're backing is going to end up. Because by the time, let's assume that Leclerc can walk out of this deal 2-3 years in, because it would just be silly for a driver to lock themselves into a deal of this length without sensible break clauses. But it is a gamble, because you put yourself at the mercy of the driver market that shifts over the next few years, how the pecking order changes, and what you think might be on the cards, what you think could be your exit ramp in the future, isn't necessarily going to be there.
And what he knows he's got is lead driver status, de facto lead driver status at one of the biggest teams in Formula One. That is worth quite a lot. So I guess that's the trade-off he's made in deciding to go this way.
I think there's a key point you made there, Scott, about the break clauses. We can look at how long this deal actually is. And as you said, this is a situation where we trust the reports that are out there. That's why we're talking about it. Yes, he has a long-term contract. There will be ways out of that. But as you said, the gamble here is whenever your break clauses come in, what's going on around the rest of the grid? What contracts are other people going to be signing? And Ed, I'm actually fascinated by the idea that drivers are signing these mega long contracts. I get the impression this hasn't existed before. What do you think is leading the teams or the drivers to go down this route of wanting to commit for such a long time in a world as fast changing as F1 can be?
Yeah, it's almost as if F1 has become less fast changing almost. The teams still work at an incredible rate, the way they produce the upgrades, etc., and new cars and all that kind of thing. But it does take time. It's like turning a massive truck around that's moving at speed now in terms of setting your direction. So you do need to look at it as kind of a multi-year thing. You can't just jump from team to team as they start going well, Juan Manuel Fangio style, perhaps, to take a very, very time-relevant comparison from the
reference.
50s. Exactly, yes. Well, that's what
showing
you
your
come
age
to me
there,
for.
Ed.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. But you can't jump around in that same way. You need to really try and build something around you, have your say in terms of the direction that the car's going to take in terms of its handling characteristics, and just have faith that you're with an organisation that can get there. And Ferrari on paper can. The trouble is that historically, it very often doesn't. So that's the really big, difficult challenge. But I think in order to be that main man at Ferrari, he did need to make that long-term commitment. Otherwise, Ferrari can quite rightly be looking around for someone who could be of a similar standing. But this actually allows them to say, OK, Leclerc's the main man. We can take a number 2 or a number 1.5, if you want to look at it that way, in order to support him. So that's what you get out of it. And yeah, you want those long-term deals because you want the security, because you never know what options are going to be there. It's impossible to know, as we've said, which year you want to be able to jump off the wagon. So the best option, nice long-term deal, but with some room to manoeuvre in terms of get-out clauses.
I would say there's two things really to factor in here. One is that element of having the team around you. You want to be part of that project. Because if you look at, I know we discuss it as a modern phenomenon in terms of these long-term deals, but if you look at the world champions of probably the last 20, 25 years, like how many won that championship without being part of a, really embedded in the project. It's very, very rare that someone moves in, takes the team off someone else and immediately becomes that number one focus point, let alone it actually work. Hamilton Mercedes is sort of the closest thing to that, but there isn't a Hamilton Mercedes-esque move on the cards for Leclerc. So it's kind of pragmatic in that sense. He's not going to force his way into Red Bull and get equal treatment alongside Verstappen. I just don't think Red Bull are going to go for that. And every other option out there, are any of them actually firmly better than what Leclerc has right now in the short to medium term? We can argue over that, does he have a brake clause? Does he have an option to get out? But he's nailing his colours to the mast. He's hitching his wagon to this prancing horse, rather.
Any more cliches?
The second part of that is that the sentimental element, he loves Ferrari. He really does. And you can't underestimate that. There is a huge emotional attachment there. He has never forgotten that Ferrari's the organisation that got him into F1 and made him an F1 race winner, backed him when he was only off the back of one solitary season at Sauber. He really does feel that he owes some loyalty to Ferrari. He wants nothing more than to win in Ferrari. And he's always said there will come a point where that doesn't count for as much as his own competitive ambitions. But when you look at what he's got in front of him, what he will need to become a world champion, right now he still thinks he can get that at Ferrari. The question is, do any of you two think he's mad for thinking that? Or is it possible that Ferrari will finally end that drought at some point over the next 5 years?
Well, it's high risk to assume Ferrari's going to give you championships, isn't it? History tells you that. But it also
they're in such a long drought, aren't they?
Well, exactly, they are. But it also tells you that a long drought can precede the Schumacher years of dominance. So that's what he'd be hoping for. I think the big problem is, it's basically you have a choice of Red Bull or something else now. And then it's a question of, is that something else something you do for short term in the hope that Red Bull becomes available, or for long term in the hope that things change? So that's the gamble that's being taken. And I think you can end up jumping around the place, missing your opportunities. You kind of need to make your decision based on what you can see, the progress being made. Real progress at Ferrari in the back end of the year. Not enough, but real progress. So that's what he'll be hoping pays off, but it could go either way. It really could.
Well, look at what happened to Daniel Ricciardo when he thought he could find somewhere where the grass was greener.
It's a cautionary tale, isn't it?
Absolutely. And also, it's a little bit like a modern-day version of Fernando Alonso. Now, the circumstances are slightly different. Ricciardo hasn't bulldozed his relationships and forced himself into finding alternatives in quite the same way. But it just shows how that's why I go back to the Hamilton Mercedes move. Is like, that's the exception, not the rule. Like, you can't just go, oh well, why doesn't he just join Aston Martin for 2026? Why is he taking himself off the market so soon? So, well, actually, sometimes it's really difficult to know exactly what you've got out there. But there is going to be that hope that and belief that he can turn it around. Because I do sincerely believe that Leclerc has bought back into the Ferrari project over the last 7 or 8 months or so. Fred Vasseur coming in, replacing Mattia Binotto, has made a big difference to Leclerc's place within Ferrari and his faith in the organisation. I don't think it's a stretch to say that relationship with Binotto had deteriorated badly by the end of last year, and probably if that had been the status quo going forward, I don't think Leclerc would have figured Ferrari's the place for him long term. I don't think Leclerc signs a long-term deal with Ferrari if things don't change the way they have under Vasseur over the last 12 months.
I also think it was very helpful for Ferrari's case that they were able to turn this car around. We've very recently done a video. You did a video on this channel, Scott, where you talked about how they effectively fixed the car for Leclerc at the end of the year. That makes it a lot easier to say, look, you can believe in us. We took this car that you couldn't really drive, that Carlos Sainz, we'll come back to him in a moment, was getting on better with. We were able to turn it into a car that gets the best out of you. We can do that again in 24, 25, 26, however long this contract goes on for. So it was a good time to get down to the negotiating table and finish a deal that's probably been in the offing for quite a while. Just before we move on to Sainz, Ed, there's a quick thing I want to ask. You guys have both mentioned the whole guessing game of where should you be if you can't get to Red Bull, what are the options? if we assume that after a year, 2 or 3 years, perhaps there might be a break here, where do you potentially foresee a gap that might emerge in the driver market? Because the whole point of these clauses, on the driver's side at least, is having that ability to have an option. So where would he be looking potentially, do you think?
Well, Mercedes is one of the obvious ones. They like him. Lewis Hamilton and George Russell are signed up for another couple of years. Lewis Hamilton could retire. You never know. He could even go at the end of next year. So that would be the obvious one. Although I think that the likelihood of that happening is also related to the likelihood of Mercedes being competitive. So I almost think the more chance there is of a Mercedes drive being available, the less appealing a destination it will be. Exactly, that's what you've got to factor in. And there's plenty of teams you can talk up with potential, but there's very few who've actually been at the top of F1 in recent years. Mercedes is one of them.
I would say that the main thing with Leclerc's deal is let's work on the basis that third-year exit clause does exist in some way, and he's able to activate it. You're taking yourself into you're at the end of the second year, I think, of the new rules.
So you know the lie of the land by then, don't you?
Exactly. So then you will see, has Red Bull dropped the ball and is vulnerable to others? Is Mercedes now the go-to place? How is the Aston Martin Honda project looking? Has Audi got its act together and turned Sauber into a front-running team? I have my doubts about that. Has Alpine no, I'm not going there. Has Haas magically turned into? Has Gene Haas finally seen the light and turned his team? You know, there's unlikely to be someone come completely out of left field and become a serious option. But all the ones that you would say are the sort of most appealing after Ferrari, so your Mercedes, Aston Martin, maybe Audi, you're going to have hard data by then. And he might not be at the front of the queue for those if someone else has taken the punt, got in there first, and is about to reap the benefits, but he will have actual data, actual evidence to go off, rather than burn his bridges at Ferrari, throw away this mega deal, only to end up in a mediocre situation anyway. But it is all contingent on those break clauses existing and all those other things aligning, which is why, if you can't guarantee that, at least make sure that what you do have your hands on is an absolutely mega contract, which is what he seems to be about to have.
Yeah, he's definitely got that. Let's have a quick word then on Carlos Sainz. Currently, Leclerc's teammate, was having a great season that maybe some of the shine was taken off at the end of the year. Scott, does it make sense for both parties to continue? Do we think they're going to continue? Is Leclerc and Sainz the partnership that Ferrari should want both of them for the long term?
I think it makes total sense to keep this relationship going. Sainz has done a very good job, and we often say that Sainz is underrated as a driver. It doesn't mean we think he's as good or better than Leclerc, but he's capable of being as good or better than Leclerc on his day, especially in certain circumstances. And apart from those final races, Sainz did an absolutely fantastic job this season, and it was really only Abu Dhabi where he sort of really dropped the ball. So I think it makes perfect sense for Ferrari to keep him. I definitely think it makes sense for him to stay at Ferrari because he has nothing better on the table at the moment. He's one of those drivers who could maybe take a punt on another project, but that kind of feels like his next deal rather than this one. The question is, do they both want the same thing in terms of longevity? And I sort of throw to Ed on this one. I think for Sainz, there's maybe a bit more of an emphasis on a slightly shorter deal so that you can maybe roll a dice, because you know you're probably never going to be the number one at Ferrari, but you're not accepting anything less than 2 years, surely.
Yeah, well, I think whatever happens, he does want to have reasonable security and a reasonably lucrative deal as well. And there are alternatives. We know Audi are quite keen on Sainz. I think the prospect of that as leverage for a deal perhaps isn't as compelling as Sainz would hope, shall we say, because that would not even be second prize to a Ferrari drive, would it? But I think the deal makes sense for them both because Carlos Sainz is a very, very good driver. He's kind of that number 1.5 I referred to earlier. And he and Leclerc have very good complementary skills. So as a two-driver lineup, it's very, very well balanced, which is great for Ferrari. Personally, I think Ferrari shouldn't drag their heels on it at all. They should offer, say, a 2+1 contract to Sainz, and Sainz should take that, provided it's remunerated in the way that he wants it to be, because I think this is a really good driver lineup. And I also don't see Sainz getting a better option. You know, people have talked about him going back to Red Bull. Well, does he really want to do that? I'm not sure that's such a great move for him. Yeah, Audi, great, nice long-term project, but will it ever get there? So there's alternatives for him, but I think Ferrari is best for him. And I actually think, alongside Leclerc, he's the best alternative because he's close enough to Leclerc, who's very fast, to do the job, and to keep Leclerc on his toes, offers another set of skills, very intelligent driver, but he is also always going to be that little step behind Leclerc in terms of pace, which is a really, really nice lineup when you're trying to go for world championships.